Inside the emperor's harem. What life was really like for imperial concubines. As night bled into the vermilion bones of the forbidden city, time itself held its breath. Within those ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of whispered secrets and silken betrayals, flickering candlelight trembled against the cold stone, like a dying heartbeat. A single shadow moved through the dim glow. A woman, shrouded in silence, wrapped in a coarse blanket like a relic bound for ritual. She crawled, not walked, toward the emperor's bed, the blanket concealing not just her body, but her will, her identity, her fate. Outside, the eunuch's footsteps echoed in measured cadence, like the slow toll of destiny's bell. Within the suffocating heart of the Qing dynasty's imperial harem, no one dared to breathe deeply. No one dared to love. And above all, no one was permitted to choose. The harem was not merely a prison of concubines. It was a chessboard where life and death were pieces moved by unseen hands. Each concubine, one among 3,000, was a name carved into the bark of a dying tree, each one hoping to bloom under the cold sun of imperial favor. For them, a single night could mean the difference between obscurity and ascent or annihilation. Beneath the translucent silk curtain, where intimacy should have been sacred, power instead became the blade. Affection, a forbidden luxury. And love, a myth spoken only in dreams too dangerous to confess. The machinery of the imperial court was a cruel theater of precision and submission. Every concubine's name was etched onto a small wooden tag, a symbol of fate, disguised as chance. After the emperor's final meal each night, those carved slivers of wood were presented. One was drawn, one life changed. But to be chosen was not a reward. It was the beginning of a relentless ritual that devoured the woman's soul with a velvet smile. She would bathe, perfume, and smooth her hair until every strand bowed in obedience. But after the cleansing, her body remained bare. She was not permitted clothing, only a blanket, her cocoon of humility, her shroud of compliance. When summoned, she would be carried by eunuchs like a parcel, her humanity stripped and replaced with silence. No footsteps, no words, and certainly no resistance. She would crawl from the foot of the imperial bed as if approaching a deity. Her gestures rehearsed with the precision of prayer, each movement laced with surrender. During intimacy, her silence was a law. Jewelry, personal trinkets banned. Not for sentiment, not for fear of assassination, but for the preservation of absolute control. There, in that hollow room, there were only 3 presences: the emperor, the concubine, and a dozen eunuchs watching like stone sentinels. Time was sacred. Even passion was timed. As the final hour approached, the eunuchs outside the room would chant loudly, breaking the spell, reminding the emperor of the clock. If no response came, they would repeat louder still until a sign was given. Then, like a wraith, the woman would crawl backward from the bed, draped once again in the cloth that both covered and erased her. But that was not the worst of it. After each imperial visitation, a question awaited in the cold air. Should it be kept? That is, should the emperor's seed be allowed to grow within her womb? If the answer was no, a dreadful procedure began, eunuchs pressing into her abdomen, stimulating acupoints until the imperial essence was expelled, drained from her like a forbidden wish denied by the stars. What seemed clinical was a theater of control. What appeared routine was, in truth, a breeding ground for exploitation. Eunuchs, those silent guardians of chastity, sometimes twisted their power into perverse rituals of dominance. They would grope, delay, touch too long, violate in ways that escaped the eye but seared into the soul. Yet the women bore it all, because to resist was to vanish. In that harem, pain became currency and silence a shield. Being summoned was both a weapon and a blessing. One accusation, one breath of disobedience, and she would never see the emperor again. Banished to the cold palace, she would fade into obscurity like ink on soaked parchment. Some, however, played the game with sharpened minds. They bartered with eunuchs, exchanged favors, whispered promises of wealth or access or hidden pleasures. In return, they bought another night, another chance, another fragile foothold toward power. In the harem, beauty was not enough. Survival belonged to the cunning. But no matter how shrewd, every concubine knew. To be chosen was not glory, it was exposure. A night of humiliation, of being packaged, presented, and dismissed. The empress alone held the right to remain in the emperor's bed till dawn. The others, no matter how favored, were nothing more than passing ghosts in his chambers. And if one erred by wearing jewelry, by making a sound, by shedding a tear, they faced punishment. Flogging, demotion, exile. Some were turned into maidservants. Some were thrown into the dark corridors of the cold palace, where laughter never reached and time no longer moved. In that world, love was a mirage. Hope, a calculated gamble. The women of the palace were not wives. They were chess pieces carved from ivory, moved not by desire, but by the strategy of emperors. They waited not for affection, but for a wooden tag that might deliver fortune or destruction. For some, that tag was a prayer. For others, a noose. And then came the red days. In our time, menstruation is a biological rhythm. In theirs, it was an omen, unclean, dangerous. Should the emperor, the son of heaven, witness blood during intimacy, the consequences were dire. Disrespect, desecration, perhaps death. So the concubines schemed. They signaled discreetly to escape visitation during their time of vulnerability. During the Han Dynasty, a golden ring homophonous with the word for menstruation was worn to indicate inconvenience. The emperor, if wise, would understand. In the Tang Dynasty, it evolved to a red dot on the cheek, a silent cry for exemption. Later, red strings on wrists, red lanterns at doors all spoke the same silent message. Body unfit. Please excuse. By the Qing dynasty, the system had become a machinery of rigid discipline. A special bureau, the Jing Yufang, managed the name tags, removing any belonging to menstruating concubines. This protected both honor and efficiency. Yet even so, refusal was perilous. If the emperor summoned, declining him could be seen as insubordination. And some women, desperate, fearful, resorted to dangerous measures, swapping places with maids of similar appearance, bribing eunuchs, risking execution just to avoid a fatal night. Others used subtle signs, faint makeup, discreet gestures to communicate the truth without defiance. These were not merely tricks, they were survival. It is easy to forget that behind these veils of ritual and secrecy were real women, breathing, bleeding, breaking. Their powerlessness was absolute. Their resistance disguised as obedience was the only power left to them. When the emperor left the Forbidden City, journeyed to summer palaces or distant retreats, the iron grip loosened. There were no name tags then, no rituals. Encounters became spontaneous, almost human. For those brief weeks, a glimpse of freedom glimmered behind the silk. But like shooting stars, they vanished too soon. The imperial harem was no fairy tale of silk and jade. It was a world of shadows and silence, where women did not live, they endured, where every smile hid calculation. where every glance could birth a prince or trigger a demise. And so, beneath the lacquered ceilings of gold and dragon motifs, life pulsed in paradoxes. The concubines of the Forbidden City were simultaneously exalted and enslaved, honored and erased. Their existence balanced precariously upon the sharp edge of imperial whim. A single look, a passing thought, a drawn name tag, each could be salvation or sentence. In that delicate dance of fate, one element stood supreme: conception. A night with the emperor, if it led to pregnancy, could alter the very fabric of a concubine's destiny. From mere ornament to imperial mother, from ghostly figure to power-wielding consort. But even this miraculous transformation was not left to nature. It was regulated, catalogued, and meticulously controlled. Every time the emperor permitted the possibility of conception, the bureaucracy of the palace roared to life. Ledgers were drawn. Names, dates, hours, lunar positions, all recorded with sacred precision. It wasn't simply bookkeeping, it was dynastic prophecy, because a child born of the emperor's bloodline wasn't merely a child. He, or in rare fortunate cases, she was a vessel of legacy, a contender in the quiet war for succession. The path to the dragon throne began not with politics or battle, but with a night beneath silk sheets. And yet, if the emperor gave no such permission, then the illusion of hope shattered cruelly. The eunuchs would act immediately, expelling the emperor's seed from the woman's body through forceful, invasive acupressure. Their hands, cold and clinical, pushed down on her abdomen until possibility leaked away into nothing. It sounds inhuman. That's because it was. And more terrifying still, those very eunuchs supposed to be guardians of chastity and order often transformed into silent predators. No knives, no bruises, but their touch lingered in ways that could never be washed away. They would delay the process, grope under the guise of duty, whisper threats or demands into trembling ears. The women had no recourse. One complaint, one moment of resistance, and they risked the emperor's disfavor or worse, being buried in obscurity, discarded like a wilted lotus. So many chose silence. Some endured, some bargained. Yes, even this darkest corridor of palace life bore its own kind of diplomacy. Bribes, promises, submission not for pleasure, but for survival. The more cooperative a concubine, the more likely the eunuch would favor her when selecting names for visitation. And that favor, in turn, became another roll of fate's dice. Each night of imperial intimacy was another chance to conceive, and conception was power. This unholy alliance between eunuch and concubine became an unspoken economy. Gifts were offered: silver, rare fabrics, whispered blessings for family members outside the palace walls. Some even surrendered parts of themselves, allowing touches that turned their stomachs to secure a better chance at being chosen. It was twisted, but in the harem, justice was not a word. It was a silence. Behind those gauzy curtains, in the hours when all the empire slept, these women waged invisible wars. Not against each other, though rivalry certainly brewed, but against their own humiliation, their own despair. They smiled, painted faces like porcelain, moved with grace, spoke with deference. But inside, they carried scars no one saw. And if the emperor's seed found root when it was not permitted, if a pregnancy occurred outside the designated lines, then the result was devastation. Abortions, forced secrecy, even executions. Imagine it. A woman, alone, carrying the seed of a god emperor, knowing that instead of honor, it might bring her death. Yet she dared not tell anyone. Sometimes she didn't even tell herself. And even when all went according to plan, Even when conception was allowed and recognized, her trials were far from over. The child she bore, still nestled in her womb, was already a threat to others, a threat to other women, to rival factions, to the line of succession. That unborn life was both shield and target, and so the surveillance began. Every movement recorded, every gesture weighed. Was she too excited? Suspicious? Too tired? Perhaps she faked illness. Did she yawn in the emperor's presence? That could be labeled disrespect. A slip of etiquette could unravel everything. The child had not yet taken its first breath, and already it was smothered under the weight of scrutiny. The eunuchs, ever watchful, recorded everything. Health status, appearance, mood, dates and signs and symptoms. These were not notes. They were evidence protection for future disputes over who held the true heir. The emperor might forget. The empire would not. In this world, a concubine could not afford even a whisper of error. A wrong scent, a wrong time. Blood where there should have been none. Every breath carried consequence. And yet, despite all this, some fought to preserve conception even when forbidden. They resisted the post-intimacy procedure, clenched their muscles, hid soaked cloths, swapped bedding. They begged the eunuchs, bribed them, pleaded with eyes instead of words. Some even risked delaying the expulsion process in secret hope that just a trace remained. But if discovered, the price was treason. The crime? Tampering with the imperial bloodline. The punishment? Torture, death, and shame carved into their legacy forever. Still, some gambled, because in the harem, the only thing worse than humiliation was insignificance. Some concubines became master tacticians. They forged alliances not with other women, but with eunuchs. These men, despite their position, held unimaginable power. They could tilt the scales, recommend names, delay or accelerate rituals, leak information, open doors that were otherwise locked for a lifetime. And so, some concubines allowed themselves to be touched with intolerable limits. A hand on the thigh, a whisper too close, not out of desire, but duty, out of desperation. The more imperial visits a woman received, the greater her chances. The closer she crawled to the emperor's heart, or at least his favor, the more her future brightened. And so they endured. Even abuse, if it could buy them a path to motherhood. Behind the emperor's door, beneath silken sheets, no fairy tale unfolded. What took place was not seduction, but submission. Each act was a negotiation, each night a battle, a move in a game where the winner claimed not love, but survival. If conception occurred during a forbidden time, two fates awaited. The first, termination, swift, silent, shrouded in shame. The second, secrecy. Some bore their children in shadows, praying for mercy later. Few found it, because in the harem, mistakes were not forgiven. They were erased. Official pregnancies were enshrined in record books, names etched in ink that carried weight across generations. Those women, those who succeeded, rose swiftly through the ranks. From concubine to consort, from shadow to sunlight. But those records also chained them. Every future moment referenced that past. Every privilege questioned, every glance measured. A mother of a prince could not falter, could not breathe wrong, could not laugh when laughter was not permitted. And above all, she could never forget that her child, her only joy in that gilded prison, was not truly hers. He belonged to the dynasty. So they walked quietly, spoke softly, prayed silently. They knew that the only true safety came not from the emperor's arms, but from his acknowledgement. His recognition was both salvation and prison. Without it, they were forgotten. With it, they were owned. Every kiss they endured was a transaction, every embrace a contract. And still, they fought, with smiles, with silence, with silk gloves hiding claws of steel, because in the harem, to survive was not to live, it was to persist, to exist through layers of pain, shame, and ritual, to turn humiliation into opportunity, and to dare to hope that one night, one name tag, one child might rewrite the stars above the Forbidden City. Within the labyrinthine corridors of the Forbidden City, the days blurred into a muted continuum of etiquette and obedience, a place of majesty cloaked in silence, where every echo was a whisper from the past, and every movement a rehearsal of submission. For the concubines trapped in this living mausoleum of desire, existence was not measured in years, but in glances, in name tags, in the rhythm of the emperor's whim. To live was to remain relevant, and the only road to relevance was to conceive. But conception, even when permitted, did not guarantee security. It merely unlocked the next level of the imperial gauntlet, a stage where danger shifted from the hands of eunuchs to the poisonous smiles of rival concubines. For the moment, a woman became a vessel for the imperial bloodline. Her womb became both sanctuary and battleground. Poison found its way into soups. Silk sashes tightened too quickly. Baths became treacherous. Midwives were bribed. Informants listened through the rice paper walls. Spies masqueraded as servants. A single stumble could mean the end not only for the child, but for the mother as well. In a court of 1,000 beauties, envy was not an emotion, it was a currency. And so those who bore imperial children learned to walk like shadows. They spoke only when addressed, never raised their voices, never smiled too widely. Joy, when it came, was carried quietly, hidden like a forbidden letter tucked into the folds of a sleeve. The birth of an imperial child, especially a son, was not just a private moment of life, it was a national event. The empress would often supervise the delivery or send her trusted attendants to do so. Every servant in the room would later be interrogated. Every towel, every drop of blood, every sound would be accounted for. The imperial bloodline had to be pure, documented, unimpeachable. And yet, for all the noise made around the birth of an heir, the woman who bore him often faded further into the mist. Her child became state property. She became a footnote, unless the emperor chose to elevate her. But most of the time, he didn't. Sometimes a concubine would spend her entire life within the inner palaces, her only legacy being a name on a registry beside a child she seldom saw. Some were even forbidden from raising their own sons. Princes were taken to be educated by eunuchs and tutors. Daughters sent away to be married off like threads sewn into foreign tapestries. Motherhood, that sacred right, was another role assigned, not chosen. But the rare ones, those who bore not only sons but affection, those were the women who wielded invisible power. Through smiles and gazes, through stories whispered to their children, they shaped the next generation of emperors. But even then, their steps were lined with thorns. The more powerful a mother became, the more enemies she accumulated. Assassination attempts, political slander, strategic isolation. There was no safe position in the Forbidden City, only shifting degrees of danger. Some concubines, childless and desperate, attempted to claim others' offspring as their own. They forged records, bribed nurses, staged elaborate deceptions. In a world where legacy was everything, such gambits were not just cunning, they were necessary. A woman who had once been overlooked could ascend to noble consort simply by mothering a powerful son. The stakes were so high, Even bloodlines could be repainted with enough ink and enough silence. But the palace had long memory. Eunuchs remembered, midwives remembered, ledger keepers remembered, and sometimes silence had a price too steep to pay. Yet even amidst the whispers and the poison, some women carved out slivers of humanity. Friendships formed, not many, not often, but enough to remind them that they were not alone in their pain. A shared glance, a faint nod, a warning passed through folded fabric. In this fortress of survival, even a single ally was worth more than pearls. Still, betrayal was more common than trust. A compliment could be a trap, a gift laced with ill intent. A seemingly sympathetic hand offered only to push them over the edge. And always, the emperor remained distant. Even when he smiled, even when he touched their faces with the tenderness of illusion, he was not theirs. He belonged to the empire. His affection, if it came, was as fleeting as a passing season. And more often than not, the emperor forgot. Faces blurred, names faded. The woman he once favored could be replaced by another name, another night, another carved tag drawn at random. That randomness was cruelty disguised as protocol. But some concubines learned how to tip the scales. They planted stories in the ears of favored eunuchs. They bribed their way back into the rotation. They created crises, fainting spells, rumors of illness, prophetic dreams, anything to draw attention. Even misfortune could be a strategy. Others went further. They used poetry, dance, music, compositions that whispered of longing and loyalty. A single tear in the right moment could etch itself into the emperor's memory. A sigh timed just right could echo louder than any proclamation. But behind each performance was desperation, a battle cry beneath silken sleeves. And then came the cold palace, the final resting place of favorless concubines, a section of the forbidden city where the halls no longer echoed with footsteps, where lanterns no longer burned, where once beautiful women sat in silence, their makeup gone, their hands worn from endless embroidery done not for joy, but to pass the days without screaming. Some were sent there for minor transgressions. Others simply faded from the emperor's memory. It didn't matter. Once in the cold palace, they were ghosts, still living, still breathing, but no longer seen. A few descended into madness, a few took their own lives, but most simply waited for a letter, a name tag, a miracle. It rarely came. Yet even there, among the withered flowers and frozen courtyards, hope sometimes sparked. A prince might rise and remember his mother. A eunuch might deliver a message in secret. A servant, touched by pity, might bring news from the outside world. And for a moment, life would stir again in those hollow eyes. But such moments were rare. The imperial harem of the Qing dynasty was a monument to control. Every rule, every ritual, every silence served a purpose: to keep the women inside from becoming more than shadows, from believing they were more than what the emperor decreed. And yet, beneath those silks and painted brows, behind every kowtow and measured breath, burned something fierce. A will to survive, a hunger to matter, a desire not to be forgotten. Because even when the world refused to see them, these women saw themselves. They dreamed, even when dreams were forbidden. They hoped, even when hope was treason. And in doing so, they carved themselves into history, not as wives or mistresses, but as survivors of a system that turned love into ceremony, and ceremony into captivity. Their voices may never be recorded in annals or scrolls, but listen closely to the winds that sweep through the forbidden city, and you will hear them. not screaming, not weeping, but whispering.